This is the North Korea nuclear crisis simulation. It builds upon the Indo-Pakistan and Israel-Iran crisis simulation, but it's the most complex of the simulations. It's primarily intent on looking at U.S. policy options in Northeast Asia against the North Korean nuclear weapons infrastructure and capabilities in the context of the other regional players, particularly China, Japan, and South Korea, which have a significant effect on U.S. policy interests. The simulation is significantly more complex than its predecessors, the Indo-Pakistan and Israel and Iran simulation, and so we'll go through the different additional rules for this sim. As with the other simulations, there are different factions. Each of the factions has a political, a foreign minister, and a military component. For the specific rules regarding these, refer to the previous simulations. The policy cards for these positions will be shown at the end of the simulation. This is the map. The terrain is fairly consistent with the previous maps used in the other simulations. Key elements are, if you look at it in China, there are different military regions, and in fact there are two northern and two southern, and those are important for the two different Chinese commanders. On the Korean Peninsula, you can see a pink line which indicates the frontier, and an orange hex side which groups together the demilitarized zone, just fortified, both for the North and the South Koreans. Circles with an X inside them are air bases, and these exist in China, North and South Korea, as well as Japan. And there are nuclear facilities indicated by triangles in China. In North Korea, there are red circles with green inset, and those indicate nuclear infrastructure sites. And there are red triangles in North Korea which indicate missile launching sites, which are important for other aspects of the simulation. As with the previous simulations, the combat system is the same. The naval combat system is identical, and there are some important differences for the surface-to-air game and for the combat between ground forces, and these will be discussed later. These are the units. You can see the DPRK, the ROK, China's northern and southern armies, and the Japanese, different types of units. You can see the explanations on the counters in the top right. Again, the format is identical to the two previous simulations. You can see on the right side the reinforcements from the U.S. In the event of war. And in the center top, you can see the reinforcements when the U.S. decides to strike at North Korean nuclear infrastructure. As with the previous simulations, there are nuclear targets. In red are the core complex of North Korea's nuclear weapons program. They're associated with modifications and values. And then there are secondary targets that are associated with other elements of either nuclear research or other regime priorities that can be struck for victory point values. This is a shot of North Korea. And again, you can see the red circles with the green inset, which indicates some of those important facilities. What is different is a slightly more detailed surface-to-air defense system. You can also see in the southern part of the map the demilitarized zone. So this is the North Korea populated by the air defense system as well as aircraft. A maximum of one aircraft can occupy each base, and you can see the air defense systems here. These are SA-5s. They have a range of 3 hexes, and so they have interlocking support. Any aircraft that passes into a hex can be attacked by the SAM units, and so they can support each other. The difference is that, unlike previous games, the American stealth aircraft are immune to the effects of the SA-5, so the U.S. has a sort of a significant advantage in destroying targets in North Korea. So here are some of the political rules. The top line I'm not going to go into major detail. The land modifiers are consistent with the previous simulation, as are the mods for air forces supporting ground attacks. Land movement is 1 hex per unit. However, if a unit is not within 5 hexes of an enemy, they can move 4 hexes. In other words, they're moving more quickly on infrastructure in a form of a strategic relocation. SAMs and missile units, which are possessed by the North Koreans and the South Koreans, and SAM units in Japan can move 3 hexes per turn. The stacking limits are 3 ships, 1 sub per hex, 1 land unit, 1 SAM unit. Units that have no limits on their stacking are artillery units, missiles units. There can be 2 aircraft per airfield and 3 aircraft stacked together for a single operation on the map that are flying. So counter my previous statement, there can be 2 aircraft per airfield. Now, in terms of air defense networks, when an aircraft operates in enemy territory, and there's no friendly ground unit adjacent to that attacking air unit, then there's a -1 to that air unit's air attackability and ground attackability, and that's meant to illustrate the effects of a country's national air defense system and interceptors that are not shown in the game interfering with that aircraft's operation. North Korea may initiate chemical warfare. It gets a +3 column shift in its, or rather, a +3 bonus to its die roll on the first turn and a +1 thereafter. There's no penalty. If the U.S. doesn't like it, they can retaliate. Any ship that moves into the same hex as a coast is attacked with an anti-ship missile of value 3. And in order to destroy Chinese ballistic missile submarines, there must be a double attack. The first to detect and then the second to strike. If the detection fails, the strike may not occur. Aircraft ranges are a lot more specific. The P-3 and the Tupolev 16, Sukhoi 27, Ilyushin 28 and F-15 have unlimited range within the context of the theater. The MiG-29 has a range of 30 hexes. The MiG-23 has a range of 20 hexes. The F-22, the F-18, the F-4 have a range of 15 hexes, and the F-16 and the A-10 have a range of 10 hexes. Many of the units that can do surface-to-air missile interception can also do ballistic missile defense. The U.S. has a national missile defense based in Fort Greely, Alaska, that's got a value of 4. Patriot systems, the PAC systems, have a range of 5 hexes, and that's a radius of a circle centered on the PAC. U.S. ships have a radius of 6 hexes. The SA-5 has 3 hexes, and the Americans have an airborne laser. It's a little bit obviously it's been canceled, but I keep it in the game for to give a perspective on policy options. It has a range of 3 hexes. So missile suppression, it's similar with other the previous simulations. An airstrike on a missile unit reduces it to a 50% probability of succeeding in a launch. And base elimination has the same effect on targets in China. Conventional missile strikes, there's a maximum of 3 volleys that may be fired from a missile launching unit. And for all missile strikes in this game, unlike the Israel-Iran simulation, the first attack must achieve a 1 in order to have struck. And then the second attack is set at 5. So it's a 50% chance of hitting, plus or minus whatever the modifier is for the target. Now, missile ranges are unlimited for American submarines and ships, and for American ground units, they've got a range of 2 hexes. And the missile rate of fire for the U.S. has no limit for tactical weapons. And in the simulation, there are specific listings of how many missiles are possessed by which countries. North Korea here has got 40 Scuds, each with a range of 22 hexes. So these are the reinforcements that are received for an American decision to strike at North Korea. So the American simply announces it. There are costs for certain aircraft when they're received as reinforcements, but none here for reinforcements received for an attack on North Korea. Most of the victory point costs are incurred for a war breaking out of the peninsula. And the Americans there have a choice to receive military units, and it costs a certain amount for aircraft as well. So obviously there's a premium by the U.S. put on not having a war break out in the Korean peninsula. So this is the focus on the DMZ. There are 8 hexes in North Korea and 8 hexes in South Korea, and those units are deployed there. You You can see the Uijiangbu corridor, which is about 2 hexes away from Seoul. So this is the deployment. The South Koreans are deployed with their 7 core units on the border. The Americans have their 2nd Division. I know, again, it's a bit anachronistic because the 2nd Division is no longer deployed on the Uijiangbu corridor, but I placed it there. I assume that they could redeploy in the event of a crisis. All of the South Korean units start at half strength. They can be activated at a cost of -10 victory points to the South Koreans, basically reflecting the call-up of their labor force into the military if they see that the North Koreans are going to be attacking. The North Koreans have a maximum deployment of 1 military unit per hex, but they have artillery units that can deploy underneath and can give additional depth to their forces. So this is essentially how it would start. Most likely the North Koreans would attack. They'd have the benefit of surprise bonus when they attack in the first turn. There's a +1. Plus they would have the benefit of the first turn use of chemical weapons, minus the defensive value of the DMZ to the South Koreans. So there's a fairly large shock value for the North Koreans crossing into South Korea. And here you can see some South Korean vessels facing off against North Korean submarines and surface units. The rules for naval combat are the same except for the stacking limits. So these are lists of boxes showing how many nuclear weapons and missiles are possessed by the different states. Like the previous sim, the Iran-Israel crisis, nuclear weapons do not perform automatically, and so a roll must be made. These here reflect the likelihood of a warhead going off if launched by that particular missile. Now, this particular simulation starts off with a randomized 1 to 10 number of North Korean nuclear weapons being determined, and then the North Koreans deploy those nuclear weapons with assets. It could be with missiles, it could be with aircraft. They have to identify where the nuclear warheads are stored, and then when the game begins, they have sort of a use it or lose it dilemma faced. Now you'll see that the South Koreans have missiles represented here as well as the Chinese. I have all the Chinese missiles represented here because Northeast Asia, unlike an Indo-Pakistan nuclear war and unlike an Israeli-Iran crisis, has the remote potential for escalation into a superpower conflict because of the proximity of North Korea to China and the fact that it's an important buffer state for the core of China's sense of security. And so China is very likely to escalate. The Americans are likely to escalate because of the proximity of their allies and the American commitment to the defense of other democracies. And so you have fundamental competing notions of legitimacy that make it possible that you'd have a full-scale nuclear war. And so I have all the nuclear weapons represented for that purpose, although most of the Chinese weapons are targeting regional countries like South Korea and Japan. Here's further weapons. Again, it's a little bit anachronistic. There would probably be 3 or 4 Jin class. I have the Jia class still hanging around, just for contrast, so students can see how it performs compared to the newer systems. Now, there's 2 separate games going on in the simulation. There's a political time scale of a month. And in that time, forces are maneuvered around, but they're not in combat. When combat occurs, particularly if North Korea attacks South Korea, or China and the U.S. have a naval clash, or North Korea attacks Japan, and Japan retaliates, then we go to a fighting time scale. A fighting time scale is consistent with the other simulations. It's 3 days per turn. Each hex being 25 kilometers across. So it's a sort of a wide-scale representation of the Northeast. Now, before there is a fighting time scale, there's a political time scale in which each turn is 1 month. And a backdrop to this entire game are the political developments going on inside North Korea. Now, in this simulation, North Korea is dying economically. There are 3 political factions in North Korea, faction A, B, and C, and they consist of 2 players, and they go through a sequence hidden from the rest of the players in the game, in which they're competing for power in North Korea, and they're competing to have their policy implemented. And so there's a specific sequence of play they have to go through. And this sequence I typically supervise very closely to make sure that they follow the rules. So each of the factions starts with 10 capital points, and these are representations of their influence within the families and the bureaucracy within North Korea. North Korea itself requires resource points, and with the passage of time, their economy is going to contract to the point of collapse. But it'll take a long time, and there's plenty of opportunity for North Korea to react before it becomes terminal. So the goal of the North Korean leadership is not only to prevail among the other factions, but also to gather the economic resources necessary to keep the economy afloat, protect the strength of the military, and to build additional nuclear and missile capabilities. So the sequence of play is first a bid. Each of the three factions presents a secret bid showing how many resource points they promise to gather from the international community. Okay, so Faction A could bid, let's say 20, and Faction B could bid 3, and Faction C could bid C. The faction that bid the most wins the bidding round. Now, what happens in immediately after that is each of the factions that lost suffers a -1 to their capital points, and the winning faction gains 5 points to their capital points. Capital points are also representations of the security of the faction. If ever the faction drops to -20, it ceases to exist. All its members are arrested for 3 generations and executed and severely marginalized. Once the faction drops below 0, it can no longer bid for power. So these groups these factions are fighting for their very survival. So after the winning faction's been determined, there is then a 1d5 roll. In other words, there's a randomized values from 1 to 5, -7. So that value can range anywhere from -6 to -2, and that's the loss of resource points to North Korea, right? And these accumulate every single turn. So now the faction that won knows how many points, resource points, need to be gathered. The next step is a maneuver competition between the different factions. Here, a faction may confront another faction, and the way that it's done is a faction will allocate 1 to 5 capital points and then roll a 1d10, typically on a randomized calculator. And the side with the largest value, and with the D10 plus the amount of points they allocated, wins half of the loser's points that were committed to the competition, and as well as keeping their own. But the opponent's factions that they lost, the opposing faction's points that were lost are forfeit. So it's basically representing tussling going on within among the factions. The next step is the declaration phase. And in this phase, the different factions may conduct acts of terror. And I'll show you this is the menu of the acts of terror. So a group that is not in power may conduct a maximum of 1 terror act indicated by an asterisk. And you'll see that conducting a terror incident it gives capital points or status to the faction. It indicates the target, what kind of target. In some of these, if the South Koreans have a ship as a target, the North Koreans must physically make an attempt against that target. Probably not against the ship, but there are some targets here where they have to physically maneuver their units in order to enable the attack. The target suffers a very small victory point loss of -0.25, but they accumulate. And here, under delivery, it indicates what platform has to be deployed for the operation to occur. Now, the faction that's in charge may conduct any one of these incidents. And some of these incidents are quite severe. They're firing rockets at the U.S., they're dropping chemical weapons on other cities. So there's a full range of relatively mild terror attacks to basically extreme levels of terror attacks. And some of these terror attacks have limits as to how often they can occur. Now, there is an instance where a faction if they're a leading faction, may make a declaration rather than an actual act. In other words, they may threaten to do an act, and any act may only be threatened once. They only gather half of the capital points rounded down, but they're not obliged to carry it out, unless the other two losing factions both agree that the winning faction must carry out the terror attack. Here's a much larger view of the terror attack menu to show you the different choices that are available to the faction. Now, once that is complete, the next phase is the solicitation phase. The North Koreans go out to the world and they ask for points. Now, there's a significant amount of delegitimization of Western countries. So anytime a faction directly communicates with Japan, South Korea, or the US, they suffer a -1 to their capital points. Now, so it's a risk. Normally, the North Korean factions will negotiate through the Chinese. And what the purpose of solicitation is to ask and beg and threaten and demand resource points from Japan, China, the ROK, or the US. Now, in this game, no one's going to make money off of this. It's a losing proposition. It's a question of how the countries distribute these points they give to North Korea. Because every point they give to North Korea is a loss in victory points to the donors. So this is a game that measures essentially an attempt to minimize losses, because there is no maximization here. Now, if North Korea does not get the points it asks for, then there's accumulation of negative points to the North Korean economy, with some sort of cumulatively severe consequences. And so there's an incentive for the North Koreans to act out, to engage in terror, to threaten war, to provoke conflict in order to pressure the Japanese, the South Koreans, and the Americans and the Chinese to cooperate. In effect, they're threatening to worsen the regional stability in order to provoke the Chinese and the Americans, the Japanese and the South Koreans to conflict with each other. Now, if as North Korea's economy gets worse, you can see the effects. Once North Korea is at -5 in terms of its resource points, all of its ground, air, and sea combat is conducted at -1. And you can see how that worsens up to -15. At -20, all ground units lose 1 step, in addition to the aforementioned effect of -15. -25, all ground units are immobile. And at -30, the entire state collapses. Now, this is important because it has huge ramifications. These are the following events that occur when a state collapses. Immediately, each of the factions, in order of their capital points, selects a military unit to represent where their family is hiding. All aircraft are eliminated. All remaining units are rolled for military ground and sea units. 1 to 3, they fall under the control of South Korea. 4 to 6, they fall under the Chinese control. And a 7 to 10 roll, the units eliminated. The North Koreans may then immediately conduct a nuclear attack with any of the weapons they have on hand, but the Americans are allowed a preemptive attack just prior. And for every successful U.S. nuclear and attack or 2 conventional attacks, they can reduce by 5% the probability that the North Koreans can launch a nuclear weapon. But it can never be reduced below 20%. The first 3 hexes to be struck are 1621, 1926, and 2031, and these indicate the 3 missile launching facilities in North Korea. Now, the Americans may conduct a decapitation attack at any time against North Korea, and the effect of that, if it's nuclear, is to shift the control of North Korea to the next largest faction. And whenever a faction is in charge, it uses the members of the other faction to man the military forces. And to act as ambassadors. So, though they don't have to, they can simply assign everyone, the other faction members, to military rule, and those members are obliged to the best of their ability to carry out the rules of the military. Now, there's an energy reactor program. If the Americans, Japanese, Chinese, and South Koreans offer a light water reactor program, it costs 10 victory points that has to be divided between the donors of ROK, Japan, and the US. It gives North Korea 2 resource points per turn. Now, in addition to those resource points, any resource points North Korea gets, it requires 1 for every turn in which it engages in conflict with South Korea. So very often it could beg for that point from the Chinese. In addition, it may divert points. It can divert 2 resource points to build a warhead, 1 to build an additional Taipodong 2 missile, which is a very long range, and it can use a resource point for warfighting. It may convert 10 capital points into a resource point. And so a faction basically can spend its own wealth to keep a war going. It may also expend 1 resource point into a capital point. In other words, it can take the money and stick in a Swiss bank account. So these are the sort of the different effects or different aspects of the domestic level dimension to the simulation. So here are some of the mission cards. This is one for North Korea. There are no other positions. The North Korea mission card is dominated by the faction, and they basically control everything as they wish. They divide the responsibilities as they wish. Typically, there's 2 players, sometimes 3 or 4 for a given faction, for the larger classes. This is a sample mission card. This is for the Chinese Northern Commander. They also control missiles. Here you have the political leader of South Korea. This is the mission card for the U.S. Air Force and the Army. This is the mission card for the Japanese Air Force. So again, the winner of the simulation is determined using the average of all of the previous plays of the same country. And those values are then compared to the current value to determine a differential, whether it's higher or lower, and the magnitude of that difference between the different players indicates who won. And there's a significant variation in winners across different games, so it's not that path dependent. But as mentioned in previous games, there are optimal ways of making these calculations that I'm still working on. So here are some additional rules that should be kept in mind when the simulation is operating. Yeah, we covered aircraft can be intercepted outside of their territory. So if any Chinese aircraft or American aircraft operate outside, they can mutually intercept each other. The ROK and DPRK, the South Korea and North Korea, cannot intercept outside of their own territory. Simply, they don't have the same level of assets. Anytime an aircraft moves into another territory and they're not intercepted, they're attacked automatically by an air factor of 1, representing other interceptors that are available. Whenever a nuclear weapon is used against a ship or a ground unit or an air unit, then that unit loses a step. So the missile suppression. Now, the Americans have a national missile defense of 4, as mentioned earlier. Their airborne laser has a range of 10 hexes, not the 3 that I mentioned before. The Americans have some of their assets on Okinawa and Guam, and those are indicated in the rules by the range in hexes. So if the Chinese player wants to nuke a target in Guam, they have to choose the missile that has the range. And if one looks at the map, you will see arrows which indicate access points to Okinawa and Guam if those targets are selected. Nuclear missiles would be launched in the turn that the player wants, and they would typically write it on a piece of paper and give it to me. All nuclear attacks have to be identified, and it's a very simple formula. You identify the base where they're launched from, the type of weapon being launched, the range in hexes, the target, the number of missiles, and then we simply resolve it. Missile defense, American missile defense, does not apply to Okinawa or Guam, although the Americans may have ships on the map that can intercept missiles that are flying overhead. So there's one additional rule which actually applies to the previous simulations as well, and that is that any economic conditional arrangements in terms of foreign aid or economic points delivered must be done in writing, and they must be given to me at the end of the simulation so I can stick them in a big pile and go through them and put them in the Excel file and evaluate what the overall points are. So this simulation is in some ways a lot more complex than the first two, because it's got a large domestic component which is opaque. to the external powers, and the external powers are trying to manage the international relations between them and the other great powers of the region. Because Japan has a substantial navy and air force. South Korea's got is again also substantial military. China is overwhelmingly strong in the region, and the U.S. has very powerful naval and air forces. And the U.S. Essentially has escalation dominance. In other words, they have a lot more nuclear weapons than China. But were China to launch its nuclear weapons at the U.S. and the U.S. were to launch nuclear weapons at China, certainly China would take a much bigger number of hits. But in the overall scheme, they both suffer massive negatives. And comparing them to the counterfactuals, which are the previous plays of the game, they both lose very, very badly. So there's a challenge to avoid the temptation of escalation, because in this simulation, the upper limit to the escalation is so high that leaders can work themselves into the negative thousands of victory points and thereby achieve absolutely nothing. So this is the most complex and in some respects the most dangerous of the environments examined by the simulations.